I would like to thank the Copernicus Center for the invitation and the warm hospitality. You know how it works. You give a title for a presentation, then you begin to write, begin to think about it, and then finally you choose to change the title. So I'm going to talk about the role of modeling in explanation in theology, and I will just in conclusion say a few words about the current debate on dispositional statements. That's my plan. Let's begin. What is an explanation in social sciences? Let's start with a hypothesis that would be necessary to discuss. The science class nearest to theology could be that of humanities or social sciences. At my university in Louvain-la-Neuve, which has different sectors, theology belongs to the sector of human sciences, of humanities, with social sciences, law, and humanities. So what is an explanation in the social sciences and humanities? The answer to this question necessarily involves two aspects. It includes a descriptive aspect and a normative aspect. A descriptive aspect, it is to compare and to analyze works of the science as they actually exist, not as we wish. And it's from these descriptions that we can clarify the sense that take the notion of explanation in their practice. But the answer to this question also includes a normative aspect, because once you leave the field relatively defined of physical objects, one might be tempted to relax his requirements and to recognize every systematized knowledge as a science. I don't know how is it in Poland, but in French television, the sport journalist speaks sometimes from footballistic science. To an intuitive knowledge, even highly organized, such football, for instance, we cannot give the name of science without condemning ourselves to understand nothing about the specific traits of optic thermodynamic or biochemistry. We won't even be led with this presupposition to refuse to recognize as sciences whole sections of physics or biology that do not reach the required systematicity. An important criterion could be scientific knowledge presupposes a split between a lived reality, which is the actual experience of knowing, and an image more or less abstract of what is known. In theology, this distinction could be formulated as follows: between language of faith and language of theology, between a confessional and a more philosophical or conceptual language, the language of experience and the language of reflection. What we would say that in these conditions, scientifically explain a phenomenon is to establish a concept, an abstract model, and to show that this scheme fits into a more comprehensive scheme as one of its part, a partial model, or as one of its special case, as submodel. The more complete, it means the more inclusive will be the explanation, the more we will estimate that the explanation serves its purpose to give reasons for what we observe, and the more we can trust it. Although this definition is very broad, it causes already two consequences. First, an explanation can only be relative. There is no radical explanation. It seems to me that there's no radical explanation, no total and definitive explanation of a phenomenon. I quote a professor for physics at your university, Vincent Lemaître. It is a son of the nephew of Georges Lemaître, I think, the nephew. He took part in the discovery of the Higgs boson. And he recently said this: to highlight the Higgs boson is not a goal in itself. All this is an endless quest. Discovery or non-discovery puts on the way of other novelties. That's life. Static understanding, to understand what is ultimately, it doesn't interest me. What is fascinating in the evolution of knowledge, if we would stop, can you imagine what a tragedy it would be? And he said a little further, and even if they find the Higgs, it would open the door to other fundamental discoveries, and we must nevertheless say that we still be nowhere. End of quote. If any explanation is relative, then any explanation has a story, because it is relative to a reference system which was provisionally adopted as a structure for attaching the scheme. On the other hand, if an explanation is relational, this implies that any explanation is not necessarily a reduction. To explain, this is not necessarily to reduce a scheme to another. And in this sense, I'm quite anti-foundationalist, I think. The covering structure is not necessarily a cause, nor a factor. The definition and the deductive nomologic model. The former formulation, scientifically explain a phenomenon, is to establish an abstract model and to show that its scheme fits into a more comprehensive scheme. It is a sort of weak form of a deductive nomologic model of sciences. According to the deductive nomologic model defended by Hempel and Oppenheim, scientific research proceeds as follows. The initial conditions of the experiment are connected to general law. It's a nomological aspect. And from this set, particular facts can be deduced and verified by the experiment. And this is the deductive aspect. The event under discussion is explained by subsuming it under general law. It is by showing that it occurred in accordance with those laws by virtue of the realization of certain specified antecedent conditions. End of quote. The explanation inserts a fact in the regularity given by scientific laws, regularity which allows to predict confidently the fact as long as the particular initial conditions are known. The quality of the explanation will be estimated by measuring the quality of prediction. If my explanation fails to predict what may be observed, then the explanation is falsified. If an explanation fails, it may be a lack of analysis or perception of the phenomenon, or the phenomenon is not reported to the relevant determinants, or there is a coaction of several determinants that has not been clarified yet. In short, the falsification identifies weaknesses and gaps in the network of determinants. It may be noted that this description of the falsification is already using a broad concept, a modified concept of an explanation. It is a broad concept of explanation in that it is a functionalist or a pragmatic one. And this notion marks the death of the representation that an explanation would be to present things are as they are and why they are so. The best explanation is the one that is the most useful, the most elegant, the most predictive, the more inclusive. To what extent the humanities satisfy these requirements? If it's possible, and I don't know if it's really possible, but perhaps it is possible to ask how to consider social phenomena as scientific facts. It doesn't make sense in theology nor in philosophy, neither. This reduction is difficult in the case of social phenomena because they are immediately given with a meaning. We can immediately perceive the meaning, or we feel the lack of meaning, and we are looking for one. This applies both for the evolution of prizes to a religious ritus or to a revolutionary movement. We may also ask to what extent is it possible or not to describe a social phenomenon without the idea of a standard. Finally, the description of this phenomena implements concepts, abstractions, which are not necessarily object of a verification. But we must take care. Something that is controllable is not necessarily something that is observable. Any scientific system includes both types of concepts. Semantic concepts, which intend to describe some aspect of a phenomenon, and syntactic concepts, which are functions linking to other concepts. This distinction between syntax and semantic is related to a state of knowledge. Entropy, for instance, was first for Carnot a syntactic concept to calculate the thermodynamical state before acquiring a semantic status with Boltzmann and Planck. In contrast, the concept of inertia, wave, plays a semantic role in classical physics, in classical mechanics, and rather a syntactic role in relativity. The falsification in theology. Even if it is possible in some cases to transform social phenomena into scientific facts, in social sciences, an explanation to be admissible must give rise to a possible refutation. It is an obvious criterion, but many assertions in social sciences are formulated so that they cannot be refuted by any observation. Can we, however, consider that the principle of falsification is applicable in theology? When we say that God exists, or that Jesus is risen from the dead, such statements, are they potentially falsifiable? And if it is the case, should we consider that the statements that express the faith are merely hypothetical? Then faith would be a number of hypotheses awaiting for corroboration. Of course, the practice of theology has never been devoid of a number of criteria for rational judgment, which can be interpreted in terms of falsifications criteria. Logical consistency, absence of contradiction, the persuasiveness of arguments and demonstrations are the clearest example for that. The Lutheran theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg proposes 4 criteria to falsify or to verify the theological statements, criteria which are, according to him, specific for theology and its objects. So, theological statements should be considered as unproven if they are not understood as hypotheses about the Judeo-Christian faith, but cannot be identified as implication of biblical tradition, even if in the light of experience that became other than before. Theological statements should be considered as unproven if they do not have a relationship with reality as a whole, a relation which can be translated in the words of the present experience, on which is identifiable by its relation with the state of affairs in philosophy. And in this case, theological statements would be critically rejected as mythical, legendary, or ideological. The theological statement should be considered as unproven if they are not able to integrate other areas of related experience, or if such integration is not even attempted. And they should be considered as unproven if their ability to elucidation remains below the state of affairs already reached in theology, if they cannot interpret the hypotheses already available, and if they do not overcome the limitation of the hypotheses already highlighted in the discussion. The second criterion from Pannenberg establishes a link between the present experience, reality as a whole, and philosophy. It is a possibility of a philosophical expression that provides the possibility to link the theological statement to reality as a whole. It's not to say here that the theological proposition can be reduced to a philosophical statement. It's only to provide the first formal universality to a theological statement. The theological statement can be understood with other forms of discourse and can enter in discussions with them. They can be translated, and it's the first criterion. The requirement for integration in other areas, the third criterion, expresses this necessary integration of theology in a debate with other forms of knowledge. Because faith is based on an indirect self-revelation through experience, history, human experience, theology has, as one of its moments, to reflect on this reality, through which God reveals himself. A reality also studied by philosophy, by humanity, by physical sciences, and so on. If the statements of these different forms of knowledge can inform each other, if such historical analysis, for example, can better understand this sociological observation, then this requirement must also apply to theology. Theology does not develop, of course, a knowledge of a special area of reality. Close in this sense to philosophy, theology makes hypotheses about reality, considered as a totality. Then there is no regular law in theology. We are dealing only with events. And one of the questions we have to answer is, in the conclusion, is to clarify the notion of divine freedom that we use in theology. Is there any form of prediction in theology? And the question could be asked too in social sciences. Is there any form of prediction in sociology, in economy, in history? The most difficult criterion, of course, is the ability to predict something. And we should clarify this point. And first of all, introduce a remark. In many cases, in the natural sciences, the predictions applies only rarely on events, but rather on classes of events. And it was the point of your, one of the points of your presentation about the relation between of mathematics and biology, I think. The predictions applies rather on classes of events. In the social sciences, an explanation has a predictive value if its hypotheses are clear enough to be controlled. Even this is difficult to achieve for a sociologist or for an economist. If economists really knew how to get out of the current crisis, we would be out of this crisis already. But it's not the case. So it's not theology only that's problems with the concept of prediction. All social sciences have the same problem. So we can at least consider this on its hypothesis. A form that can take the prediction in social sciences is the relevance of a theory for new phenomena. It's also the fertility of a theory or of a system. This is a form that can take the requirement of prediction in theology. It's not to predict what God will do tomorrow, but economists themselves cannot predict how the stock market will evolve tomorrow. And sociologists are also unable to describe the society in 10 years. How will be our society in 10 years? Sociologists are unable to predict this. And perhaps God is something a little bit more complex than the stock market, perhaps. But we can speak of an ability to predict when a theological theory developed for a specific question allows us to understand better other questions. Or when a theory allows us to understand a new question or to interpret a new phenomenon. As you can imagine, this hypothesis assumes that theology has to bind its speech, its discourse, to conceptual hypotheses, to philosophical and eventually ontological hypotheses. Now, I would like to say a few words about a distinction that is often made to ensure the scientific nature of humanities dealing with the natural sciences. It is a distinction between explaining and understanding. Wolfhard Pannenberg highlights a structural analogy between explaining and understanding. In both cases, singular elements are related to something more general in order to understand these individual elements by placing them in a more inclusive set. And this more inclusive set can be transformed in order to include all these singular elements. This is a reason to consider this distinction. Is this a reason, to consider this distinction between explaining and understanding as an expression of a myth or myth of the two cultures? A myth of the two cultures would be naturalistic conceived distinction between the world of nature and the world of the spirit, or the world of the mind. And this sort of dualistic comprehension of the world, a naturalistic distinction, would be the reason why we distinguish between to explain and to understand. And then we would distinguish sciences are devoted to explanation and sciences devoted to comprehension, which would be the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften. I don't think so, because there is a major difference. Understanding includes the singular element into a whole. It shall immediately report to the world of those we must interpret, while the explanation refers to a coherent description of the world. The disturbance of the explanation refers to an inconsistency in the description of the world, while disturbances of understanding refer to what can be false or one-sided in the relation of the interpreter to his world. Certainly there are structural similarities as to judge properly what is given or to relate to a totality of meaning, but there is in understanding a dimension which is immediately prescriptive about how the subject must understand his relation to the world, while explanation ends in an exclusively descriptive dimension. For me, understanding and explaining, it's a tension between two aspects of the rationality, and not between two areas of knowledge that could exist in being separated from one from another. Perhaps to sum up, to give more time. Is it encore? 5 minutes? Okay. To sum up. So, the explanation, as we have discussed so far, is fundamentally based on the construction of a model. The internal relation between model elements or relationships between different models constitutes a scientific explanation. In different way, of course, for natural sciences, for social sciences, for philosophy, or for theology. This has two consequences. First, one of the tasks of theology is to build hypothetical models and to relate these models with other models, philosophical, scientific, or social models. Secondly, I don't accept the separation between natural sciences, which would explain, and social sciences we would understand. Explaining and understanding are rather two moments of knowledge. Second point, it seems to me that we can consider that there is an explanation in theology if the theological statement is open to falsification in the form we have exposed. The two first points have a consequence. In order to build models that could be falsified, even by other sciences, theology must use a philosophical language to allow the conversation and the translation between the sciences. Third point, the interest of an explanation in theology for a special point is related to the interest of this model to elucidate another point. And this is the usual form of prediction in social sciences, in philosophy, or in theology. I remark, this is ultimately a pragmatic argument. My last point, dispositional statements. What role plays the discussion, the actual current discussion of dispositional statements? A dispositional statement is a statement that focuses on a skill, a disposition in a reality, ability to produce an effect. For instance, sugar is soluble. It is a conditional. This medicine is an antidepressant, or the liquid is acidic. These are dispositions, dispositional statements. Since the 17th century, science has tried to replace the dispositions, the powers, by laws and regularities. logical empirism sought to replace dispositional statements by categorical statements. The predicate is categorical if conditions, if there's no condition for its application. For instance, this is water. This is water, or this is sugar. That's categorical predicate, but it is soluble for the sugar. Sorry, it is a dispositional statement because it is conditional. In certain circumstances, if you put the sugar in water, it will dissolve. You immediately see the difficulty raised by quantum mechanics and even by relativity. We cannot define the position or the speed of a quantum reality independently of an observation. And to speak about a gravitational mass, it must be assumed a context for its appearance, a gravitational field. But to speak about inertial mass implies a resistance to a possible acceleration. They are both conditional. But the two cases are not identical. In the second case, in the example of the mass, it has a definite value because and after the measurement. In the first case, in quantum mechanics, the value revealed by the interaction is not independent from the interaction itself. However, in none of the two examples, we have a categorical predicates. We have only contextual statements and different degrees of contextuality. Can we suppress all dispositional statements? And what is a disposition when it does not manifest itself in action? What is meant to be soluble when you don't try to put it in water? What does it mean to say that something is breakable so long as you don't try to break it? It's what Aristotle called a potentia. But ontologically, what is a potentia? If it's not a merely possibility, but an ability to react in such circumstances. Let's go to theology. In theology, to try to explain something sub ratione Dei, it's always more or less to refer to a disposition. Divine properties are dispositional. This debate on the ontological status of dispositions raises the question of the possible metaphysical dimension of a scientific discourse. And then we will find arise a whole series of issues familiar to the medievals, philosophers or theologians. Can we know something about the divine properties from the divine action? And to clarify, and then arise a long debate on potentia Dei, about divine freedom, and so on. To explain by using a property, is it to explain something? Do I explain something that when I say that sugar is soluble? Or is it merely a tautology? Can we achieve a clear definition of these properties, of these dispositions? And to clarify what we mean by a disposition, we could use a counterfactual conditional. The sugar is soluble in water means if the sugar is dipped in water, it will dissolve. But so long as I don't put the sugar in the water is a counterfactual. This debate could therefore lead to a reinterpretation of the role of counterfactual conditional in theology. Without the sin of Adam, would God become a man? That was a classical question in medieval. It's a counterfactual conditional. Or if Hitler had not attacked Russia, would he have won the war? It's a counterfactual conditional. And it's a way to give an importance, to describe the importance of a criterion, for instance, here in the defeat of Hitler. So, The modest goal of this presentation was first to give some hypotheses about explanation in theology, and secondly, to show the potential interest of this debate about dispositional statements for theology. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.